Hello, my name is Martha Thorne, and I'm the Director of Institutional Relations and Curation at Gallery Institute. Welcome to Gallery Talks. It's a space created to expand the dialogue with leading voices in architecture, design, and contemporary art. It's a chance to reflect on ideas, processes, and stories that shape the living archive of Gallery. Here, every conversation begins with a project, a work, or a thought that has already become part of our journey. Gallery Talks is both a record and an expansion and a look to the future. It's a way to continue the narratives we have built through our films, documentaries, and original productions. We're recording Gallery Talks at the Media Center Studios of PCI. That stands for Creative Science Park in Aveiro, Portugal. It's a space for innovation and cutting edge technology that allows us to create interactive content and explore new ways of connecting art, architecture, and contemporary thought. Today, we have a Siza special. Álvaro Siza, as you know, is that wonderful and famous Portuguese architect. We're celebrating also the world premiere of the documentary Siza, which will soon debut on our streaming platform, Gallery Originals. Today, we have two distinguished guests who will help us delve deeper into the creative universe of Álvaro Siza Vieira, his work, his legacy, and his enduring influence on contemporary architecture. For our first episode, we have architect and friend of Álvaro Siza, Carlos Castanheira, and he's also a longtime collaborator of Siza, the architect, and António Choupina, who is an architect, curator, researcher, and currently director of architecture at Serralves Foundation. So let's jump right into the first question, Carlos. You've worked alongside Álvaro Siza for decades. What has that experience been like in practice? Is it a coexistence of master and disciple? Two friends, I know you share a friendship, but I'm sure working professionally means many things to you. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Well, everything started as a teacher. So he is, and he's still a teacher. So it was a long time ago when we, almost immediately after the revolution of 25 of April 74. So it was possible to study architecture because it was difficult times. And Caesar was already known, not very much in worldwide, but immediately after the starting of my studies in 76, it was a big publication of Caesar, and he became quite famous in Europe. So for us to have among many teachers one person that was known outside of Portugal, that was some publications, was of course a way of thinking about why this guy is published and the others are not published. And so that was the starting of knowledge of his work. Also, where I lived, where I'm living now, he built one beautiful small building, and so it was starting to know about, to learn about, and I was lucky that he was 3 years my teacher, and he also invited me to help him with during my studies to in little projects. So it was a very interesting and crazy moment, a crazy time during my study years, where the teaching and learning of architecture was made in a fine art school, not in a faculty of architecture. It was even a different ambience, and so it started this knowing each other. Of course, me as a student, him as a teacher, in a very interesting moment. And he, of course, after that, he started to work in Berlin. Was invited and made some competitions. He won some competitions in Berlin, and he slowly by slowly started to be to be more present outside of the school and less present in the school. But every time that he was back in school, he was very, very present, very, very interesting. And so it was, let's say, the beginning of the teacher. And later, of course, I finished the studies and I had a chance to work with him in Holland. And that was, let's say, the beginning of a collaboration between the two of us that stays till now. We're still working together.
How did that collaboration work when you have a project or when CISA received a commission? Did you talk about it together as equals? Was he always somehow the teacher, even in recent years, that you've been a collaborator with him for many years? How was that? What is the process, the beginning and the relationship with him?
Well, I think it is very clear that we are both architects, but there's a big difference between those two architects. Okay, there's no doubt about that. If somebody says that it's not like that, that we are equal, uh, that's wrong. It's making a very bad interpretation of the situation. So he's an architect, but he has been always different, and I always understood that. I always respect that. But I also am very sharp, let's say, when I don't like this or when I'm not agree with that. And that I think is the base of our collaboration and mostly about our friendship. So I'm not a yes man. Okay, so when I don't like, I say that I don't like, and then we discuss it. And Caesar is always very keen in learning with even common workers, common people on and I learned about that. So uh, usually the engineers can be arrogant and they don't know enough and are not sufficient. But a worker, especially when he's very good, he knows about materials, about the way of doing things. And Caesar questions many times more the workers than the engineers. And so he can learn from a simple man and he talks the same level, learning from that, of course. And of course, if he doesn't agree with, let's say, the way he's finishing, they discuss it. And that it was it was more teaching or more learning than at school itself. So I learn a lot with him on the construction side, on the discussions with clients, when he needs to be very strong, defending his position as an architect, defending his project, or when he's negotiating it, and when he's trying to do the best of it, and to learn to achieve a high quality project, a quality product, is necessary to negotiate. And this is very good in this, although it sometimes it's a bit upset and sometimes even angry. But the final target is to make a good thing, and to do that, we need to make a project, and then you need to build it. So like many times I say, we are not concept architects, we are building architects. So that is the major target, major objective that we want to know. That we learn not in 5 years of school, or we learn with time, with being with him, and making many kilometers and many miles with him. So many projects, so to learn how to do it.
Great. Antonio, you also work with CISA and many projects, and I know even more recently. What is your experience? Because one thing is if you study with him and then continue throughout your career, but what is your story?
Well, my story starts back when I was a little boy, and that's the first time that I met Caesar actually. Because his previous office at Rua da Alegria, where Carlos was sort of chief of staff of the team at the time, he often went outside to the coffee shop to draw, which was right next to my school. And so I would often bump into this man who would be in this mystical cloud of smoke drawing. And because I love drawing, I would often sit down and join him for drawing. And so this must have been late 80s, early 90s, because I clearly remember that he was doing sort of the University Olympics for Palermo. And so there's all these athletes jumping around. And so I was very excited about the drawings. And but I never actually knew who he was back then. So it's only after I go into architecture school that he is no longer a teacher, but the chair of a discipline that was named after his own mentor's book, the general theory of organizing space. And so he taught a couple of lessons, and that's when we sort of reunited in a sense and got reacquainted. And we've sort of also developed sort of a very nice friendship, I would say, even though the age gap is enormous. So he's sort of almost like a sort of a spiritual grandfather of sorts, and the way that he sort of always sort of excited me about the work, about sort of discovering things, about, I would say, a general empathy towards everything, the people that work with us, the building and how it relates to the site, the users of the building. And so I've been fortunate enough to work with him on a lot of sort of cultural projects in terms of exhibitions abroad, but also on particular projects like the International Furniture Fair in Shanghai, that you were a part of the opening as well, or more recently, a design center in Bergamo in Italy. And so working with him is always, as Carlos, I think this is a metaphor from somebody else that Carlos often uses, which is the playing chess. So he's the white ones that goes first. Uh, and um, and so he always goes first. He puts the first step in and allows you the space also to give your contributions in a sense. Um, and I also think that when he works with other people, whether it be Carlos, whether it be Eduardo Sotomora, and he does these co-authorships, that he feels a sort of freedom, perhaps, in regard to the work that he does solo in the studio, because he quite often says, "Well, this is your responsibility." So he gives us also a sense that if something goes wrong with the project, we are responsible. But also, if we something goes right, we're also equally responsible.
Right.
And so there's this sort of passing over of the baton, if you will, which is something that happened to him at a very early age as well with Fernando Távora, his mentor, who afforded him the opportunity to design the now famous tea house. And so I think he always feels this sense of sort of paying it forward in a sense, but also he has a very keen eye for people's talents, whether it be communication, whether it be design, whether it be archiving, whether it be exhibiting. And so he surrounds himself with people who are talented in the ways that he finds them talented, but also that have sort of a vision that complements his in a way.
Great. Carlos, you made the comment that Caesar is different and his architecture is different. So, could you tell me a little bit what you mean by it's different? And then how do you or other collaborators contribute to that?
Well, he is different because he doesn't know very well how to explain what he's doing. So, and that might be strange to say that, but there's many things that he makes it because doesn't come by an addition. So it's not 1 + 1 + 2 + 4, and then the final result is that it's a mathematic or pragmatic result. There's much more in Caesar than that, and that is what we still are searching for, and what is still searching for, although his age is still searching for that. And that is what for me is the most interesting things. Many times we are, by example, developing a project, and the project is already well developed, and he comes with a strange sketch, strange in sense of the development of the project. And then, by example, I can ask why this strange thing, and then he sketch in a bit uncomfortable situation, and he has no answer for that, and he says, because I like it. And this means for me a lot, because there are many things in your life that you like and you cannot explain. And just to like it is very important. And although the age, and I can give you an example of some years ago that we went to Lecce, a city in the south of Italy, and in Italy it's always a thing that is very, very complicated. Many people talking, everybody needs to talk. There's before starting the lecture, there's even the cat and the dog comes to talk. So and then suddenly I was asked to say something. I didn't know that, and I didn't have much to say, because then I just said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you the youngest architect that I know." And I really feel that, because for me, he's still the most young person, architect that I know, because he's still very fresh, very looking for to the moment that we are living. He's adapting very much his way of working to the new way of working that we are always changing, because as you can remember, he is now 92, and so when he started work, it was only paper and pencil. Now we have a lot of ways to do a project, and he's always adapting himself, learning. He cannot draw with the computer, but he knows how is the thing is done. So it sometimes he gets a bit nervous when somebody is doing in a very slow way, because he knows that how the the tools can be used. And so this is for me always very surprising. Is not giving up, although the age. And is always giving very interesting, surprising answers to any kind of problems that you need to solve. And that is what is for me the difference between Caesar and other architects that I know, of course. Other people that know exactly, can justify, explain one by one why they are doing this. They did this project, why they did this detail. And Caesar doesn't explain everything, because it is a project and the building that explains by itself. So, and I think that is the most important thing. It's not easy to see it, to understand it, but of course, with also with training like I had, you start to understand. But also, you need to keep your personality, your collaboration, and say if you don't like it. And many times he listens and he accepts the critics to change it or even to reinforce it. And that is the most interesting thing. But because of course we need to understand that I am Carlos and he is Álvaro. So and it will be always like that.
Antonio, from what Carlos has said, over the years, Cisa learning and being open and listening. Talk a little bit about how he listens to work, and is patience something that you see in his works? It seems to be a contrast. On one hand, patience to learn, go slowly, to listen, but then adaptability. So, how would you comment on that contrast?
Well, I think that, as Carlos is saying about the youngest architect he knows, he has this almost sort of childlike ingenuity. Even nowadays, anywhere he goes, he wants to know what that is, what type of lamp, what type. So he's very curious about the smallest detail. So I think that curiosity is something that's very healthy. And in the same way that a child will be sort of listening to you, trying to understand something, they will also be voracious about getting things done. And so I think he has sort of this very endearing quality, because it's difficult to say that there's no ego. None of us is absent of ego, but ego is rarely present. And so, because the work, as Carlos was saying, speaks for itself. And so I think his approach is always one of seeing the site, often looking at the model of just the topography for a couple of days, and then coming back with a sketch, sometimes a surprising sketch, or a series of sketches, and that's why often people joke that he is a human printer, because he keeps drawing day and night. He's the first inhabitant of all his buildings in his mind. And so what he does basically is, through sketches, put everything, all the issues on the table and quickly take them out. Hence why he has little patience for softwares. He jokes that they're the piano players, but everything takes too long, and sketching is very fast and easy to solve issues. And so it's really a way of filtering things, where the silence is sort of the distilling that comes after all of this chaos, this hectic sort of first bubbling of the project, is sort of calmer. That's when silence comes into it, I think. And it's sort of the echo, let's say, of a lot of thought about the function, about the people that will occupy it, about himself occupying it. And whenever you find something that sort of hits just right, or even is sometimes a coincidence, a measurement that accidentally repeats itself. Often he thinks about grids, of course, but he often jokes that it's God. And he's not a particularly religious person, even though he had a Catholic upbringing. He has a sister who's a nun. But he says when there's sort of this chance, this luck that something happens, that's sort of, in a way, the hand of God. And so I think that's also this sort of achievement of sort of that we all look for as architects, I think. It's state of beauty, which is divine in a sense. And that state of beauty is quiet, and it's beautiful.
I understand when you talk about him looking at a site and the context and the topography and meditating about that. That seems to be he's listening to a place. How does he listen to time?
Well, I think time in Caesar's architecture is a very vague notion, in the sense that he always mentions this importance of the continuity of history, in the sense that we're not alone, we're not reinventing everything, reinventing the wheel. And so time is present, but at the same time that things have to be timeless. And so that the quality of time can be captivated by different aspects, whether that be the thickness of a wall, that like the church in Michael is, like that pregnant wall that sort of brings in this memory of when churches used to be thicker and made of stone. And that then allows light to come into the buildings in different ways. And then light also gives it a different sense of the record of time as the light comes in through the buildings. And I think he's very acutely aware of his own mortal time, and also of the speed with which he has to do things now if he wants to get things done. And so I think there's many layers to this subject of time, which is sort of particular interest, particularly in his subconscious, as he's always sort of. I often say, "Oh, this reminds me of this building from Le Corbusier." Doesn't matter, I didn't think about that, but I did visit it in 1990 something, and so it all gets back cataloged in your subconscious, and then so there's this out of time frame of buildings that then also sort of influences design.
And you remember that I mentioned, and to me it was a really surprising comment on the part of Álvaro Siza. When I was visiting a new building at Serralves, and it's a very modern building, yet it's in a setting that seems like it fits very naturally. And I said to him, "You did this very modern building. How could you do that here?" And he said, "Martha, when people see a new building and they assume that it could have been there forever, we've made a successful building." So I think in that sense, for me, in any case, it expressed the idea that he doesn't want to shock people with his buildings, yet he can use modern language, he can use different languages, but somehow it has to fit and feel comfortable. Would you agree with that?
Yes, also because I think that modernity is sort of a fluctuating concept. And so the Parthenon was the most modern thing when it was built. the Alhambra was the most modern thing when it was built. And so I think we're always being as modern as we can at the time that we are building.
Yeah.
And for him, sort of that modernity is how you sort of look at the project. So in that case of the new wing, it's funny that you would say that because he often sort of not credits himself for the building, but the trees around it, as if to say the building had to move around in order to respect the existing trees and sort of cohabitate the space with the trees, with nature.
Yes.
And so I think his modern approach is something that sometimes we associate with language, with visual style, let's say, in a sense. But for him, it's a mishmash of many, many different things. Modernity for him is sort of a concept that is very different from modernism, for example, which
Yeah.
is a very sort of specific moment in time. And so, yeah, for me, that is a very, very special building that he designed. It has its own name. It's the Álvaro Siza wing now.
Yeah.
And it's special not just because it celebrates sort of this 25th anniversary of his pre-existing museum, but because of the way that he understands the space. This idea this very Platonic idea of geometry in space as the form of good. And so that space can also contribute to sort of the well-being of the people that inhabit it.
Carlos, Antonio began to speak of drawings,
Yes.
and Siza seems to be a prolific sketcher, drawer. He still is, after many, many years, seems to have this impulse, this need to draw. And sometimes drawing for him is a conversation, he said, first with himself, then with others. Do you also draw? And how do you use the drawings with Caesar? Is that an element to talk about architecture? Do you discuss them? Tell me a little bit more about this element of drawing in the process.
Well, I believe that it's not necessary to sketch to make good architecture, but in Caesar it become his way of communication, and like you said, not only to others, but especially for himself.
Okay.
Because he makes those things to himself. Okay, and it become more known because of the publications and so. It doesn't make sketches for publication. Makes sketch for uh, for work. So for to discuss with himself if that thing is okay. To leave those sketches and later to come back to sketches with very a very disorganized process, but it's a process that works very well. And sometimes even we see some other sketches from other colleagues of us that you can see that the sketches were made after the building. So you don't have in Caesar sketch that. So it is easy. It's very. It's always doubting. It's always questioning those sketches, and it is a process that many times it's not only a process of progress, but it's also a process of not to be bored of the moment, because it needs to be. He has no other thing. He has no hobbies, so it goes at home, and he puts television on, and he starts to sketch because the television is boring, and doing nothing is very boring, and so he sketches. He sketches about many things, and sometimes about something that he just saw, or something that comes because he saw something, he comes to his mind, and then he finished that, and because this is a nice thing, he starts to do something similar, and that's to do directly with architecture or with things that he's doing in that moment, or about other things. And I just say that he doesn't has a hobby, but he has other kind of interests like sculpture. So, and many he decides to think about or to do a sculpture. The process is the same as architecture. So he starts to sketch, starts to see how the sculpture is in space, or how it will be in space. It he did also some sculptures where you can be inside the sculpture. So because architecture is that, okay, it's something that you can be around, but you can also be in. Usually, not all architecture, but mostly of the architecture projects, architecture buildings. But the same thing, the same process by doing sculpture, because it needs other people to finish the sculptures, and the same thing with other interests that he has. Some of them he does it alone, like the writing. That is very important, very important, and it is a must to understand his architecture, because he writes very shortly, but you need to read the lines, but even between the lines. And the same thing with architecture. You need to learn to read the project and the building, but to understand between the lines. And that is, of course, very difficult, not easy for many people, and and then sometimes even very tiring, because there's a lot to read in architecture and to read these texts. And I think that is the most the most interesting thing in Caesar is that all this that is a bit hidden, not yet discovered. There's a lot of writing about that, a lot of things saying that he's writing, he's drawing very well because his uncle bought him some pencils. For me, it's very interesting stories, but they're not just stories. I mean, there's something inside him that is special and that he developed. By example, he also says that his wife could draw much better than him. That he also learned with the wife. But some years ago, I made a publication, an exhibition about sketches after dinner, because it's something that he usually does when he goes to visit some friends. And after dinner, he starts to sketch. It could be interpreted as a very unpolite things, because well, you should be more present in the dinner. But no, it starts to sketch. Sometimes it has nothing to do with the dinner. Sometimes it makes some portraits of the people. And then with the help of these best friends, I made two books. And one of the books, the first sketch, is a portrait of Alcino Sotinho from 1967. And I can say that it's very interesting, but very poor. And if you compare with now, let's say the sketch from 2000, you can see that there's a big evolution. So it has been a hard-working process, a very study how it could be better, and by training and by training, by working. And that is also something that you learn when you are close to him, that only you only can be a genius not because you are born, but because you work to be a genius. And I think that is what he's still searching for. He's still trying to be a genius, although the age.
That's fantastic. Antonio, let's talk a little bit about drawings, because you said you saw him draw in the beginning. Now Carlos has said the great evolution. I know you've done exhibitions with many of his drawings. What what do you hope the message is when you exhibit his drawings, when you see them? What is the message you hope that they communicate?
Well, that's tricky because it's sort of multi-layered, let's
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, you're exhibiting something that was never meant to be exhibited to begin with. On the other hand, it's sort of a really didactic sort of process, particularly for young students and, of course, researchers who are doing several works to really sort of analyze how the work evolves, what stays the same, what connects them. And but I think for Caesar, sort of drawing, as Carlos mentions, of course, starts with his uncle, sort of the fairy tale of the uncle that puts them on his lap, drawing the horse of the neighbor next door. Uh, but um, but I think more than that, sort of drawing became sort of the cornerstone of what we now call the Porto School. And it's curious because he's always pushing you to draw more. Like I draw quite a bit, and he's always like, "Oh, you need to practice more this and this." So he's always trying to improve you because he himself has sort of practiced so much to the point where everything now sort of flows effortlessly, let's say. And he's often the one to point out whenever I draw something. He says, "Oh no, I draw that there," and he said, "No, I draw that." He said, "No, no, you draw differently. I draw like this." So so you draw something else. So he's always pushing you in a way through the subject of drawing as well, even during work. But then exhibiting the drawing is almost like exhibiting sort of a manuscript of a writer before you deliver the final book. So you're sort of going through the different iterations of what could have been but wasn't, what came to be, and sort of that fleeting sort of Baudelarian nymph that we see of a building, the shadow that we have in our mind that we're always trying to pin down into something as perfect as possible in an imperfect world.
Mm.
And so drawings are his way of communicating. And I think not just for the academic community, of course, they're of value in terms of research. But I think even for the general public, they have a great appeal because Caesar doesn't just draw architecture. Every single sort of construction drawing is somehow accompanied by the face of a woman, by a hand that sort of writes a little note or a poem on the corner. And so it's filled with sort of layers of information that go beyond sort of simple sketching in a way. And and I think for him drawing this is I'm doing psychoanalysis right now, so bear with me. But I think because his wife who passed away at 32, she was such a sort of incredible draftsman that so much so that he himself did not draw as much in those days as he does now. For him, it's almost a way that she lives on in this
Mm.
parallel dimension of drawing
Mhm.
with him. So hence why he has so many self-portraits of him flying on a bird and riding like a horseman and so forth. He creates sort of this dimension where she pops up every once in a while on a sketchbook 10 years after she passed away. And so she's sort of an underlying, almost sublimated presence of this value of drawing, of a world where he can live a different life from the life that he lives in this world.
So it sounds like something very personal. It's a way to create a parallel world, to remember people, remember places. It's a way to communicate with others, to test out ideas, to be a hobby, to take up time. Do you think that students nowadays should or could learn from this process of drawing and should be drawing more?
Well, definitely. I think there's a tendency to draw less. I'm currently preparing an exhibition on Frank Gehry, and I thought it was quite curious how he started digital and became more and more analog, which is sort of the opposite of what's happening to all the offices nowadays. And I think younger generations in particular, I think sketching is important, not just sort of as a sort of a diary of sorts, a process of the evolution of the design, but there's this sort of unconscious component. This idea that the hand is sort of an extension of the brain that sometimes comes up with surprising things that you're not really thinking about. What Juhani Palasma or sometimes calls, the thinking hand or the eyes of the skin. And so that sort of is drawing is sort of the place where you can sort of have the opportunity, the time. We were talking about time before, to sort of lay that down. Um, so yes, I think it's still important to draw.
Right. Carlos, do you draw?
Of course, I need to draw.
Yeah, a lot.
As I learned, yes, yes. Of course, I need to draw. It's a very good way to communicate, but like we said before, communicate with myself, but also with other people that is around. We work not only on the paper on the tables in the office, but sometimes we need to also to draw on the walls of the construction site. That is something that is known for many years. That it happens to it's the best way to explain and to express what we want. But maybe I'm not so positive as Antonio about the future because Although in some schools, the first year, it is not digital. It's all by hand. But then after that, things change very, very fast. I have some young people in my office, and I'm very surprised how they are uh, full digital. And it's very difficult to well to put them a pencil in his hand is not very easy. But there are exceptions. There are very good exceptions, of course, and there are people that understand and study, learn with Caesar and even with other architects. But it's something that it's the digital is very strong. It's very easy in the sense it's very common becomes, and this is I don't know if we are going to lose that. But I'm not only talking about sketching, but also drawing and many other things like for example writing. So everybody had his handwriting, and now everybody has his own type of that is chosen in a huge list of things to write to type, not to write by hand. And of course the writing by hand in when I was young, small, we will learn to make a beautiful writing, not because just to be beautiful, but so that you could read and the others could read. And the same thing with the sketching. So if you make not very nice sketches, maybe you cannot communicate with other people, even with yourself. So to have a kind of progress and to sketch better is the better way of communication, and that is what Caesar did, and that's what we try. When we, for example, with Caesar, we are talking about something and he doesn't understand. And he said, make a sketch. And then we need to make a sketch so that he understands what we are saying. Because it's a different way of communication. Talking is very important. We cannot stop talking. But there's this our special way as architects to sketch is very important. But like I say in the beginning, is not a must of mandatory to sketch to make good architecture, but is, let's say, our way of doing it. It's the way we learn at the fine art school with our teachers, many good teachers, architects, and also painters, sculptures. Because in the staff of our school we had these teachers, also our friends, and so it is our way, in a way, uh, I would say very special, and is a very become quite common. Some people sketch better, some kids sketch not so good, but it's a very interesting way. And of course, you can see the results of the quality, and it is, if you compare with digital, faster. It is a
No render.
protein of it.
It's really interesting, and I appreciate so much that you've reminded us the importance of sketches as a tool of communication. And communication is so important when you have ideas to be able to discuss them with others and understand. And Antonio, you've brought out the idea of the connection of the brain with the body. And in the end, architecture is what we experience. We all live in space, we interact with the materials, the light, the temperature. So it is architecture is also a physical as well as the other senses, but it's a place that we feel it. Let me ask you both a little bit about what Caesar means for the history of Portuguese architecture, what you hope is contributed not only to Portuguese architecture, but to 20th century and 21st century architecture throughout the world. And let me ask you also a rather personal question. I remember visiting a house by Caesar and then other buildings afterwards, but I was first conscious in the house. It had a staircase. As you went up, the staircase became narrower and narrower. And when you got to the top, there was a landing, and then you felt comfortable and safe again. And in other buildings, I experienced a similar idea where Caesar, in his building, somehow takes you to a precipice, takes you to an extreme, and then the architecture opens up and you feel comfortable again. Is that a characteristic of his architecture? And is that something that you hope is communicated, or is that the type of legacy that you hope is communicated? Or what are the other points of the architecture of Caesar that you hope can be shared, preserved, and future generations and other places learn from him? Antonia, what do you think?
Well, I would pick up where we left just now, just by saying that, well, the famous quote that of Le Corbusier, that he prefers drawing to talking because it leaves less room for lying, and but also that there's other dimension, which is travel drawings, which is something that's very important to Caesar, in the sense that, and I think that's something that he brings back to a younger generation, and something that he leaves as a record for posterity, for history, is this idea that not only traveling is important, so you see the scale, so you see the materials, but the record of it is in a way important, because it's your own filtering of what you thought was important at that point in time. And so I think that's, and he loved traveling. He can't travel anymore nowadays, but it's for him, sort of this continuous discovery of others was a discovery of the self. And I think his architecture, in a way, is the very same thing. We're going through the building and we're discovering the building, but we're also discovering ourselves as we're going through it. So that's why sometimes you might feel like you're upon a precipice, and then he rescues you from the precipice by revealing another space. But in reality, what he's doing is sort of this almost um, psychological architecture, in which sort of the physical aspect of it sort of embraces the user. So it protects them from the rain as you're going in. It slants slightly, so it's more comfortable for you to come in. It squeezes you in at one point, so you're sort of realizing that, oh, I'm going into something, I'm transitioning into something else. It expands you into something else, into the landscape, to the focal point of the building, whatever it may be. And sort of, it tries to find that connection in the experience of building, which is sort of almost the opposite of what we look for in architectural competitions nowadays. Everybody looks for the artificial intelligence image that's going to be sort of the brand image of the design. And that's not what Caesar does. Caesar creates a promenade, a route, an experience for the user. And the building is sort of the vessel of that experience. But what he's designing, in fact, is the experience.
Carlos, how do you feel about Caesar's contribution to Portuguese and contemporary architecture? Would you agree with Antonio?
Yes, I agree, but I would say that there's a bit more than that. Uh, first, part first, and then talking about the contribution. Um, when you decide to talk with Caesar, because you need a house or you need a, doesn't matter what kind of building, you are in troubles because you to find a solution. Okay, because you come to a professional, and of course you need to you are under his way of doing things, interpreting spaces, and then you are subject to what he wants you to feel. I give you, for example, two short examples, two easy examples. I think I'm talking about the tea house, the restaurant Bonova, and one for me very important, that is a swimming pool on the sea. Okay. So you don't achieve the buildings as you want. Is as he wants. So, and it is all this process, for example, in the tea house, that you arrive by car, you need to park there, and then you just start to walk, going north, then going up the stair, then little by little you start to see the horizon, and then it turns again to the west, and then you see the rocks, and then you see that you have the entrance, and then suddenly you are squeezed in the very small door, and not a big door, because he really wants to make a small door. Then when you go in again, he shows you the horizon through a small window. So it is him showing you how to live inside the building, as not you that decide how to live in that building. And that is the museum, that is the house, that is everything. So it's why he, let's say, is not a black box man, so that the user is free to use the inside as he pleases. Now, there's no black box. It's very white box, and very clear the way you go in, the way you walk, and that is exactly what's it is different from Caesar. So Caesar decides in a way, as an architect, your future life, and this is going to give you the pleasure of being inside and living in that certain way, because the way you come inside a sleeping room but can be very different. It can be very bad or very good, and that is what he's always engaged to do it, and searching it by sketching, by the drawings, because we didn't talk much about the drawings, and also about the models. So that were and still are, let's say, the instruments, the tools to be more close to the future, because we are making future all the time. We are every day we are trying to figure out how the future will be, how that will be, and then of course sometimes when we many times, or even people say that always when we go inside the finishing building, we also are surprised uh, with the light, although it was that light that we thought about, we wanted to be, but then we are even surprised that the space are bigger than what we thought, smaller than we thought. But we tried to achieve that kind of quality, that quality in space, quality in sculpture, but also in the way of living, in the way of using it, and that is what is very surprising. That he is making future, and nothing is by accident. And so that is what is for me very, very interesting. It's what I still try to do in the project that I do alone, because there are projects that I do with him, others I do alone, and that is what it makes the big difference. So he doesn't leave anything for the others. So he tries to do everything by himself with the help of the others, and that is, of course, a lot of work. Sometimes very, very, very. We need to be very energetic, very, very optimist to do so much, because we could do it without so much work, but it's necessary to do a lot of work. Regarding the Caesar and this existence, we are here today because it exists, and
Absolutely.
we are talking about Portuguese architecture in the same moment that we are talking about the architecture of Caesar, because it exists, existed, and it still exists, and it will exist in the future. And I think is let's say, of course, the revolution was important. Of course, our life is made of many episodes, but he made us being architects in the world. Without him, we were architects. That's it. And of course he changed it. Of course, there are many people that don't accept this, and they want to be this nature is part of the history. It comes in the Bible. So many people need to kill the father to to well to be present, to affirm, and it. he didn't. It was not important for him kill the father. So he had no not the need of saying that everything that the others are doing is bad. So it just is the continuity, like Antonio said, is the continuity of the history, and is making history, and he will be here always. He will be always traveling, like I usually say. Some people will travel with him, uh, always. I'm of course I'm a bit um, nervous, doubting, discussing also with myself about the big change that we are now facing, and how this young people especially will change the world, and how all these what we were talking to now, it will be important, because the tools that we are having now are too easy, and soon you don't need almost to think. You just ask, and somebody will answer you. Somebody no, will answer it, and that is what and then everything that is answered, it's right, and it's not right.
Yeah.
Many times.
That's
Uh, I would
Antonio.
perhaps just add quickly on the subject of continuity, because he speaks so much about it quite often, the big sort of mottos of architects don't invent anything, they transform reality. But then often he does the opposite, which is curious. So I think in terms, and also sort of as the director of a museum who has this obligation, but also pleasure of being able to preserve and promote his legacy forward. I think it's not just about the physical drawings, which are precious. It's not just about the buildings, which are fantastic. It's not even about the awards, because he never seeked awards. He often says you have to work, and then the awards will come. If you're thinking about awards, then you're not going to get any of them, because you're just thinking about the building too much. So I think for him, I always saw him as a pioneer of sorts. Even though he talks about continuity, he sort of drafted his own path in architecture on an international level. So yes, he owes a lot to his mentors, to a lot of people, as we owe to him, of course, undoubtedly. And but he was always on the frontier of sort of, yes, this is tradition, but. And so whether it be in the revolution, as Carlos was mentioning, like this expression that was very popular of the time, that the architects were the hand of the people. And he said, well, no, we listen to the people. So there's that participation, which is important, this connection. And so they become our advocates in a sense. But then we sort of find the best solution for them. Or even in the tea house, the Carlos was mentioning, like the horizon line on the window, which he actually didn't know was going to happen. He thought you would see the ocean or you would see the sky, either or. You ended up seeing both, because of perspective. And so he was very happy about it. But so there's discoveries that happen along the way. And he's always pioneering in whatever he's doing, whether it be the museum in Porto Alegre, the Ibericamargo Foundation, and this idea of sort of almost a visual palette cleanser, which are the routes that lead to the main exhibition rooms, or the most recent church in France, in Rennes, where the archbishop, as he's coming in to the church, he turns to Caesar and he asks, well, Mr. Caesar, why is the cross not facing us when we come into the church? And he says, well, we all require a path in order to be deserving of looking in the face of God. And so he always has these sort of very sort of humoristic and really interesting approaches to life, which I would say are pioneering, are very specific to him, and in a way very difficult to copy, even though it looks like his architecture is simple, but it's not. It's very complex. It's not actually easy to copy at all.
Mm.
And I think that's his true legacy, to really sort of always find what's different within what is normal, because we all design a door, we all design a museum, we all design, like, what is special about this? What is my outlook on this? And so I think questioning everything is his default mode. Uh,
Mhm. Oh, that's beautiful. I really appreciate those lessons that we can learn not only in architecture but in our lives from someone like Siza. And I think it is very interesting, Carlos, that you mentioned that he really opened up Portugal and Portuguese architecture to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world then could come to Portugal, and Portugal could go to the rest of the world. And I think that goes along with your idea of communication, connection, and Antonio talking about what's special in the architecture of Caesar is not always the form, the structure, the material, but it's that discovery that he continually does. That's a beautiful legacy. And just to end this wonderful conversation, and I'm enjoying it so much, could you tell me maybe a personal story that you've had with Caesar? It could be as an architect, it could be as a friend, it could be as a travel companion, but perhaps there's something you remember that's endearing or revealing that you would be able to share with our audience.
Well, I have thousands of stories. I even promised him that I would write a book about it because some of them are really very funny. But there's one thing that I would like also to say is that we have been now talking very nicely about Caesar, but he can be also very, very, very naughty, especially when he is very upset with the way the official people treat him. Because the way we have been talking today, it seems that everything is blue sky, but there are many clouds, very dark clouds in his long way, especially now that he is very well known, many prizes, like Antonio said, but still these very poor people that are in charge are always making our lives, especially his life, difficult, and he gets very upset. His humor gets very, very badly, and so sometimes we can see Caesar in not so nice, not so friendly, but he has reasons for that. But he also can go from like in the work, so we can change projects, and he is very focused on the next project. He comes from one to the other very easily. The same thing, they can go from a bad moment to a very funny moment, even making fun of himself. I don't know anybody that made so much fun about himself, especially by sketching, uh, talking about his nose, by example. That usually we don't make jokes about ourselves. We like to make jokes about the others. But he is very, very funny. And I have many things, but by example, 2 weeks ago, I went to pick him from his house or his office. We now do that. We don't allow him more to travel by taxi. And he came inside my car, and he was looking front, very concentrated in front, and he started to talk. And I was driving, and he said, I made some analysis, everything okay. I made an exam to the heart, perfect. I made an exam to the lungs, perfect. I made this, I made that, all these exams, everything perfect. Comes the silent. Only me is not okay. He has this very, very special humor that he shares with the very close friends, but also when we are working in my office with younger people, we are all equal, like in the start of this talk. But of course, there are differences. And he is very, very, very nice, very friendly, very sharp with people, because he likes like in a game. Okay, so when you play tennis, you need to somebody from the other side that sets the ball back to you. If not, there is no game anymore. So when there's some people that are playing the same game. So he has a lot of fun in working, a lot of fun in being with presents. And then we are, let's say, discussing. He accepts the critique from a young architect if this critic is intelligent. And being intelligent is a need to be near Caesar, because he hates incompetent people. He hates ambiguous and mostly false people. That is what he really hates. And then he's very sharp and can be very, very cruel even sometimes.
Carlos, thank you for that aspect of Caesar, reinforcing the human aspect and a human being with all of those feelings and sensations. It's just it reminds me that behind every work, every novel, every building, every piece of music is a human being, and those who rejoice in being humans, in the end, they give us so much more. Thank you. Do you have an anecdote, a memory, an experience, Antonio, you'd like
Well,
to share?
too many memories as well, different ones, but well, I think my first memory, of course, is sort of meeting him. That's sort of my first sort of
Yeah.
visual impact. But I think sort of for me, obviously, you learn immensely working with him, even in the small things that you might not expect. But I think traveling with him for me is some of the most special moments. Because often here he'll might call you and say, Antonio, look in your magic phone. The football team win, and but then when you're traveling, it's always special. I remember when he had gone several times to Florence to visit the Lawrencean Library by Michelangelo, but it was always closed. And so when he got the keys of the city, I organized everything in Florence with a foundation that no longer exists, and to give him the keys of the city. And so he said, Antonio, I'm only going to Florence at the Lawrencean Library. So that was the focus, not the keys of the city. And so we go to the Lawrencean Library, and he's sort of inspecting it as if he's about to find Michelangelo himself hidden under the staircase. Because there's this story of the room that he was under the Lawrencean Library where he sketched a lot while he was hiding from the Medici during the coup. And so he's sort of inspecting everything to this detail. And then at one point, his back started hurting. And so he's like, gonna have to sit for a little bit. And so he sits on this fountain that was designed by Verrocchio. And all the security guards did not have the heart to tell him that he couldn't sit on it. And and so I just said, well, Caesar, maybe we should go outside. There's a little coffee shop. We can have a hot drink, and that might make you feel better. So we go out. We head towards the Palazzo Vecchio, and there's the statue of David right in front of it. And so he stands there staring at the statue of David for a while, uh, both in awe and sort of inspiration, but also it's like when you see Niagara Falls and they suddenly seem smaller than they are because in your mind they're so monumental. And then he said, "Well, let's go have some hot chocolate." And so, yeah, so we have many, many, of those trips to Berlin. His very last trip actually was to Berlin, that we did together for the Bauhaus Centennial. And so that was sort of really symbolic because every once in a while he always tries to escape the official program. So, ooh, let's go and see some Brunner Taut buildings, or let's go and do this. And so I think in that way he's always very lively. So he's not sort of the shy, very serious man that people perhaps perceive him from a distance,
No.
but he's sort of this sort of very sort of lovable character who sings when he's designing or whistles, whether it be the Beatles or something else. And so sort of that sort of I think the moments that will stay with us, not just the architecture, but the people. Yeah.
So he is clearly the youngest architect that we know, in spite of his 92 years. Let me just thank Carlos Castanheira, Antonio Choupina. What a wonderful conversation, revealing more information about Álvaro Siza, your relationships and friendships with him, and also about architecture in general. It's a pleasure to have you in Gallery Talks, and I look forward to a next conversation with you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.